San Francisco is a city of contrasts, a place where beauty and danger coexist in equal measure. Known for its iconic Golden Gate Bridge, its scenic hills, and its famous fog that rolls in like a heavy blanket. It's a city that's both captivating and unsettling. But beneath all of its charm lies a secret, a legend so terrifying that even the bravest of locals refuse to speak of it in the light of day. A legend that for years was nothing more than a whispered tale in the darkest corners of the city's most eerie neighborhoods. But what happens when a legend is no longer just a story? What happens when it becomes all too real? There's a name that sends a shiver down the spine of anyone who dares to speak it. The Executioner. The tale begins long ago, passed from one generation to the next. A ghostly story told over campfires, late-night drinks and dark bars, and quiet conversations between the old-timers of San Francisco. The Executioner, they say, is a shadow that lurks within the fog, a figure who waits patiently only to strike when the night is at its darkest. And when he strikes, there is no mercy. The Executioner is not a simple killer. He's not some random figure of violence that appears and disappears without rhyme or reason. No, he's something far more chilling. A force of nature, a grim and relentless figure whose presence is felt long before he's ever seen. The locals, especially those who live in the older parts of the city, speak of him as if he's more than just a man. They describe him as a vengeful spirit, a manifestation of justice gone too far, a creature whose heart has been hardened by time and betrayal. Some say he is a man who once walked among them, a former soldier or a lawman who was wronged by the very system he swore to protect. Others believe he is something darker, a creature born of the city's tortured history, its crimes, and its failures. No matter the story, the result is always the same. The Executioner is a harbinger of death, a figure who hunts those who have evaded justice. He is said to target criminals, the corrupt, the ones who slip through the cracks of the system. They say he punishes them for the sins they've committed, for the lives they've destroyed, and for the countless people who have suffered because of their actions. He's not after petty criminals or those who commit small crimes, but the worst among them, those who have caused irreparable harm. The truth, however, is far more unsettling. The Executioner's judgment is not always fair. It's not always righteous. In fact, many believe his choice of victims is as much a result of his twisted sense of justice as it is a reflection of the darkness that exists within him. And it's said that the Executioner's presence is felt before it's ever seen. The old-timers tell stories of how they could hear him long before they ever laid eyes on him. It starts with a feeling, a gut instinct that something isn't right. The air grows thick and heavy, and the temperature drops, even on the warmest nights. A cold chill runs down the spine of anyone who's been in the city long enough to know better. Then comes the sound, the faint echo of heavy footsteps, muffled by the dense fog that blankets the streets of San Francisco. They say you can hear them from blocks away. The slow, methodical steps of the executioner, echoing in the distance. It's a sound that fills the air with dread, a sound that makes even the most hardened of city dwellers stop in their tracks and look over their shoulder. As the footsteps draw closer, the fog seems to grow even thicker, wrapping around the city like a suffocating shroud. There's something unnerving about it, something that doesn't quite feel natural. And then, just when you think it can't get worse, you hear it. The unmistakable sound of a blade being sharpened, its sharp edge screeching as it slides against a whetstone. The sound is enough to freeze you in place, to make you question your very existence. It's a sound that tells you that something horrible is coming, that death is near, and if you're unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, it might just be your death. A legend has been passed down through the years, carried by those who know better than to speak of it too loudly. Over time, as decades passed, the story of the executioner became just that. A story. A myth. A ghostly tale that lost its power over the generations. People moved on, forgetting the fear that once gripped their ancestors. The city grew, and with it, the people grew complacent. They dismissed the tale as nothing more than an urban legend, a silly story meant to scare children. And yet, deep down, there were always those who kept their eyes peeled when the fog rolled in, and when the streets grew too quiet. Because, as much as they wanted to believe that the executioner was nothing more than a fairy tale, something deep inside them whispered that he was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And then, one day, the fog rolled in thicker than usual. The streets, once bustling with life, grew eerily silent, as if the city itself was holding its breath. People felt it in the air, that familiar feeling of dread, that sense that something was wrong. It wasn't just the fog. It was the unmistakable feeling that the legend of the executioner had returned, that the city's dark secret was no longer just a myth. And so it begins again. The figure, cloaked in shadows, his blade glinting in the mist, is back to collect his due. No one knows who will be next, but the whispers are everywhere. The executioner is on the hunt, and this time, it's not just a story. This time, it's real. For the first time in decades, the people of San Francisco are forced to face the truth. The city has awakened the monster it thought it had buried long ago. And now the nightmare has come to life. It was a quiet night in San Francisco, the kind where the fog was thick and heavy, rolling in from the bay like a ghostly shroud. The streets, usually filled with the hum of late-night activity, seemed to hold their breath, as if the city itself was waiting for something, though no one could quite say what. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic, the occasional horn, and the soft tap of shoes against the wet pavement. But in the stillness of the night, something far darker was unfolding. In a small, unassuming apartment near Fisherman's Wharf, Gregory Collins lay dead. The city had known his name, though not for any good reason. Collins was a man with a reputation, one of power, influence, and a string of shady dealings that stretched far beyond the city's borders. He had enemies in every corner of San Francisco, from crooked businessmen to dangerous criminals, and even a few that the police couldn't quite name. He was the kind of man who lived his life walking on the edge, always one step away from a bad decision, a misstep, or an enemy getting even. But no one had expected him to go out like this. When his body was discovered, it didn't seem like the result of a random crime. The police had arrived on the scene quickly, alerted by a worried neighbor who hadn't seen Collins in days. The apartment was eerily quiet, the only sign of life being the dim glow of a flickering light coming from the hallway. At first, they thought it might have been a simple robbery gone wrong, another victim in the tangled mess of San Francisco's dark underworld. But as they moved through the apartment, something didn't sit right. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing to suggest that anyone had broken in or struggled to get past a locked door. No overturned furniture. No signs of a violent confrontation. The apartment was clean, almost too clean. As the officers ventured further in, they found Gregory Collins lying in the center of the room, his body unnervingly still, his expression frozen in a grimace of pain. At first glance, it seemed like any ordinary death. But there was one thing that stood out, a detail that would soon haunt the officers, the city, and everyone who heard about it. Above Collins' body, carved into the wall with sharp precision, was a symbol, an executioner's axe, the blade outlined in deep, dark red. The image was stark, haunting, and completely out of place. The symbol was clear, unmistakable. The executioner had struck. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. Gregory Collins's death, the police believed, was no random act of violence. The neighbors, those who had lived near Collins for years, started talking in hushed voices. Their words trembled with fear. Some said the executioner's mark was just a coincidence. It was an unusual choice of symbol, yes, but it didn't necessarily mean the infamous figure had returned. Perhaps it was just someone trying to send a message. Someone with a dark sense of humor. But there were others, those who had grown up hearing the chilling stories of the executioner. These were the same people who knew the old tales, the ones that had been passed down through generations like a dark heirloom. The stories were as old as the city itself, tales of a mysterious figure who struck from the shadows, whose very presence sent a wave of fear through those who lived in the fog-covered streets. The executioner had become a myth, an urban legend that no one had truly believed in for years. But after Collins's death, things started to change. The whispers grew louder, and the thought began to settle into the minds of those who lived in the old parts of the city. The executioner had returned. Some tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to the work of a copycat, someone who was merely mimicking the legend for their own dark reasons. But others, who had known better, were afraid to even utter the words. It was too familiar. The symbol on the wall, the clean execution, the eerie calm before the storm. It was exactly how the old stories described it. The executioner wasn't a man. He was an idea, a force that could never truly die. And now, it seemed, the legend was becoming all too real. The police, meanwhile, were scrambling to make sense of it all. They found no witnesses, no clues, no leads that could point them in the right direction. All they had was the body of Gregory Collins and a symbol on the wall that seemed to mock them. Theories about motive flooded in. Jealousy, revenge, some twisted form of vigilante justice. But nothing fit. Collins had enemies, sure, but who would go to such extreme lengths to make a statement? And why leave a symbol that seemed so deliberate, so personal? Detective Mark Bennett was the one assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator who had seen his share of strange deaths and unsolved mysteries. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As he walked through Collins's apartment, his mind raced with possibilities. It didn't make sense. Nothing about the scene added up. He'd been on cases before where the killer left clues, but this was different. This wasn't just about the crime. It was about something deeper, something that reached back into the city's haunted past. The detective sat at his desk late into the night, staring at the crime scene photos, trying to find something, anything, that would lead him to an answer. But the longer he stared, the more unsettled he became. The symbol on the wall kept drawing his eyes, its sharp lines and bloody hue almost mocking him It was as if the killer had deliberately left it there, daring anyone who found it to solve the riddle. And then it hit him. The symbol wasn't just a mark. It was a message. A warning. A warning. As the days passed, the city began to stir with fear. The thought of the executioner's return crept into the minds of everyone who had heard the stories. People began to lock their doors at night, avoid the alleyways, and keep to the main streets. They spoke of the fog like it was a living thing, something that could conceal the killer until it was too late. Some even claimed to have seen shadows moving in the mist, shapes that lingered just out of sight. The city was on edge, and though the police tried to reassure the public that there was no cause for alarm, no one was truly convinced. And then, a few days later, another body was found. This time, the victim was a local thief, a petty criminal named Jake Miller. Like Collins, Miller had a long history of bad choices and dangerous associations. But when he was discovered dead in an abandoned warehouse, the pattern became clear. No forced entry, no robbery, no witnesses, just a body and a symbol. A different symbol this time, but unmistakably tied to the first. The executioner was back, and no one knew who would be next. Gregory Collins was only the beginning. The legend had returned, and with it, a fresh wave of terror had descended upon San Francisco. The air in San Francisco had become heavy with fear. People spoke of the executioner's return in hushed voices, exchanging nervous glances as they walked the streets. The fog seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. It didn't take long before the next body was found. This time, it was in a downtown alley, hidden away from the busy streets and the prying eyes of the public. It was a place where the shadows seemed to swallow everything whole, where the echoes of footsteps were drowned by the silence of the night. The victim was Jake Miller, a man with a reputation that wasn't much better than the likes of Gregory Collins. Jake had lived a life on the edge, a small-time thief who had gotten tangled up in things far too dangerous for someone of his caliber. He had crossed paths with people who weren't easily fooled, and it seemed that in the end, it was those very people who would come back to claim him. But there was something about this death that felt different. The scene was eerily similar to Collins's. No signs of a robbery, no struggle, nothing that pointed to the typical violence of the streets. Jake Miller's body was found sprawled out on the cold ground, blood pooling beneath him in a way that seemed almost deliberate. His face was a grim mask of pain, his mouth slightly agape, as if the terror had struck him so suddenly that he hadn't had time to react. The blood didn't tell the full story, though. No, it was the mark that had been left behind this time that sent the chill creeping down the spines of those who discovered him. Above Miller's body, just as it had been in Collins's apartment, was a symbol. An executioner's axe, crude but unmistakable, carved into the brick wall above his head. The blood around it seemed to form a kind of sickly halo around the image, making it look as though the weapon itself had a life of its own, ready to strike down anyone who dared to cross its path. It was a chilling sight, one that spoke of something far more terrifying than the usual violence that ran through the city's veins. This wasn't just a murder, it was a message, and it was the same message that had been left on Collins's wall. The executioner was real, and he had returned. The police were stumped. They couldn't find any clues that led them to the killer. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no sign of forced entry, or any attempt at a robbery. The death didn't make sense. How was the killer slipping past them, evading all their efforts to catch him? How was he able to leave his mark, so unmistakable and ominous, without anyone noticing his presence? The more they investigated, the more questions they had, and the fewer answers they could find. As news of Jake Miller's death spread, the city began to stir with an unease that was impossible to ignore. People started locking their doors at night, refusing to leave their homes after dark. Some even started avoiding certain parts of the city, staying away from the alleyways and hidden corners where they might be caught off guard. Fear had begun to creep into the everyday lives of the people of San Francisco, and with each passing day, the terror only seemed to grow. Some of the more superstitious residents started leaving offerings near their homes. Coins, flowers, even food, hoping to appease whatever dark force had come to claim them. They said it couldn't hurt to try. After all, if the executioner was real, perhaps the best way to stay safe was to avoid his notice altogether. Others, more skeptical, simply locked their doors tighter and tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. But deep down, they all knew it was only a matter of time before the executioner struck again. The stories began to spread like wildfire. People exchanged rumors on street corners, in bars, and over coffee in the morning. Some swore that they had seen him, lurking in the shadows, hidden in the fog. Others claimed to have heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, a blade scraping against a sharpening stone. But when they turned to look, there was no one there. Everyone had a story, a theory, or a suspicion about who the executioner might be, or where he might strike next. The tales grew with every telling, becoming more twisted, more sinister, until they began to take on a life of their own. But no one truly believed that the executioner could be real, not until more bodies started to appear. In the weeks that followed, more victims turned up, each death marked with the same brutal precision, the same symbol carved into the walls. At first, the police were in denial. They refused to believe that the city was being stalked by something so dark, so terrifying. But as the bodies piled up, it became undeniable. The executioner wasn't just some twisted myth. He was a reality that San Francisco would have to face, whether they were ready for it or not. People started to talk in whispers, and the streets, once lively with the bustle of city life, began to quiet down. The once vibrant neighborhoods were now filled with an air of tension and dread. No one felt safe. No one was sure who would be next. At night, the fog rolled in, thicker than ever, and the city seemed to vanish into it, swallowed whole by the shadows. The once bright lights of the city now flickered uneasily, casting long, eerie shadows across empty streets. People stayed indoors, hearts racing with the terror of what might happen if they stepped outside. They didn't know who the executioner would come for, but they knew one thing for certain. It could be anyone. The police were no closer to solving the mystery than they had been when Collins had died. Every lead they followed ended in a dead end, and every theory they came up with only led to more questions. They had no idea who the executioner was or where he was hiding, but the fear continued to grow. The streets were haunted not just by the legend of the executioner, but by the very real threat of his next strike. And as the fog continued to roll in, thick and suffocating, the people of San Francisco began to wonder just how much longer they could live in fear. They had no idea who the executioner was or when he would strike again. But one thing was certain: the nightmare was far from over. The second strike had come, and the city was no closer to understanding the terror that had been unleashed. Each death seemed more senseless than the last, and with each new victim, the symbol of the executioner grew darker, more ominous, a sign of doom that no one could escape. San Francisco was no longer just a city. It was a place where legends came to life, where fear was a constant companion, and where no one could rest easy until the executioner's reign of terror had ended. But deep down, the people knew that day might never come. As the days turned into weeks, whispers of the executioner began to take root in the minds of the people of San Francisco once again. The city had been gripped by an eerie sense of unease, an anxiety that refused to go away. It wasn't just the deaths, though they were enough to send shockwaves through the population. It was something deeper, something that hovered in the air, like the thick fog that rolled in every night. People spoke in hushed voices of strange occurrences, of shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, of eerie figures glimpsed in the fog, watching, waiting. Some even swore they'd heard whispers on the wind, soft murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. As the fog grew thicker, the lines between reality and myth began to blur. The rumor spread quickly. Those who had dared to dismiss the old stories of the executioner as mere legends now found themselves caught in the grip of fear. People began to lock their doors tighter, even during the day, and the more superstitious of them began to leave offerings in the street. Candles, coins, flowers, hoping, praying that the shadows wouldn't find them. The city's once bustling nightlife came to a screeching halt, with more and more people staying indoors after dark, fearing that the executioner would strike again. It wasn't long before the stories began to morph into something darker. Those who lived in the older neighborhoods of San Francisco, where the fog seemed to have a life of its own, spoke of hearing footsteps echoing through empty streets in the dead of night, too heavy and deliberate to belong to any ordinary person. Some claimed to have seen figures darting through alleyways, always just out of sight, always cloaked in darkness. The most unsettling part, though, was that no one seemed to be able to pin down what these figures were. Some claimed it was just the fog playing tricks on them, while others believed it was something much worse, something that had returned after years of silence. One of those who began to feel the weight of the growing fear was Clara. She had grown up hearing the stories of the executioner. Of course, everyone in the city knew them, and most dismissed them as nothing more than a warning to keep people from walking the streets at night. Clara had always laughed at the idea, dismissing the tales as just old folklore. After all, it had been years since anyone had seen the figure, and the police had caught a few criminals along the way. The legend of the executioner was just that, nothing more than a spooky bedtime story passed down to scare children. But Clara's perception of the world was about to change forever. It was an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind where the streets were alive with the usual hum of city activity. Clara had worked late, finishing a project for her design company. She was used to the late hours, the quiet, and the solitude that came with the city's night shift. As she stepped out of her office and into the chilly evening, the fog had already begun to roll in, covering the city in its familiar blanket. The air was thick, and the street lights cast strange shadows against the low-lying mist. Clara pulled her coat tighter around her body and began to walk home, her footsteps echoing against the pavement. At first, everything seemed normal. The usual street noise from nearby shops and restaurants was faint but present in the background. Clara kept her head down, her thoughts drifting to the day's events, but there was a strange feeling in the air, something she couldn't quite place. It started as a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, a quiet unease that made her glance over her shoulder every few steps. She shrugged it off at first. After all, the fog did strange things to the mind, but the feeling only intensified with each passing block. By the time Clara reached the edge of Chinatown, the feeling had become unbearable. She could no longer ignore it. The fog had thickened, making the city feel closed in, suffocating. The streets were deserted, the usual buzz of people and traffic absent. Clara's heartbeat quickened, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She had a strange sensation that someone, or something, was watching her. Every time she turned a corner, she felt a shift in the air, as if the shadows were moving just behind her, too fast to catch, too close to ignore. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. There was no one else on the street, and the fog could make things seem far scarier than they really were. But her instincts were screaming at her to hurry, to get home, to lock herself inside and never come out again. But then, as she passed a small alleyway, she heard it. A sound, faint at first. A soft, deliberate shuffle of footsteps, echoing in the stillness of the fog. Clara froze. The footsteps stopped. She stood there, motionless, heart pounding in her chest. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, everything was silent again, save for the distant sound of the wind. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. The figure was barely visible at first, a shadow cloaked in the swirling fog, but there was no mistaking the shape. It was tall, imposing, and its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it were stalking its prey. The executioner. Clara's blood ran cold, and her stomach twisted in fear. The stories she had dismissed as nothing more than superstition, the stories she had laughed at, came crashing back into her mind. The executioner had returned. Her instincts kicked in, and she turned to run, but her legs felt heavy, like they were moving through molasses. Her heart raced, and every step she took felt like it brought her closer to something horrible. The fog seemed to close in around her, thickening, swirling, like it had a life of its own, pushing her toward the figure. With a burst of energy, she sprinted down the street, her breath ragged, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that it drowned out everything else. But no matter how fast she ran, the figure remained in the corner of her vision, just out of reach, always there, just behind the mist. She didn't stop running, until she reached her apartment building. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her keys, her mind in a haze. She rushed inside, slammed the door behind her, and locked it with trembling hands. She leaned against the door, gasping for air, her mind racing. But the nightmare didn't end there. As Clara stumbled into her living room, trying to steady her breath, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. On the window, on the condensation left behind by the thick fog, there was something written. A message. He's real. Clara never spoke again after that night. Her voice, once filled with laughter and confidence, was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that clung to her like a second skin. She couldn't escape what she had seen, what she had felt. The executioner was not just a legend. He was real, and he had found her. The next morning, she was gone. Her apartment empty. Her life erased by the very figure she had dismissed as nothing more than an old ghost story. And the city, still shrouded in fog, was left wondering who would be next. The fear that had already settled over San Francisco seemed to thicken with every passing day. What began as a whisper of a legend was now a growing nightmare that had the entire city in its grip. As the bodies piled up and the executioner's mark appeared more frequently, the air in the streets grew heavier, suffused with dread. The fog that enveloped the city seemed to thicken, both metaphorically and literally, clouding the judgment of anyone brave enough to venture out at night. Those who had once scoffed at the idea of the executioner's return were now looking over their shoulders, feeling the chilling touch of terror creeping into their everyday lives. The police, desperate to piece together the fragments of this terrifying puzzle, found themselves in over their heads. Each new victim seemed to come from a different part of the city, from different walks of life. Yet all of them shared one chilling connection: the brutal mark of the executioner, an axe carved into their skin or drawn somewhere near their bodies. It was the same signature, the same unholy symbol, unmistakable and terrifying in its simplicity. But beyond the mark, there was no evidence to follow, no clues to give the police any hope of tracking down the killer. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, no discernible pattern other than the mark itself. The executioner seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. He was like a shadow slipping through the cracks of the city's defenses, always one step ahead of the authorities. There were nights when the police would set up roadblocks, trying to anticipate his next move, only for nothing to happen. They would scour the neighborhoods, check security footage, interview witnesses, and come up with nothing but more questions. They were growing desperate, The city was growing desperate. People locked themselves indoors, afraid to step outside after dark, afraid that they too would be marked. Despite the terror, some still tried to make sense of the nightmare. In whispered conversations, in dimly lit bars, in the shadowed corners of alleyways, people speculated about who the executioner really was. There were rumors, of course, whispers about his true identity that flickered like dim flames. Some said he had been a man of the law, once a police officer, perhaps, who had become disillusioned with the justice system. A vigilante turned rogue, someone who had sworn to protect the city, but had grown bitter when justice was too often denied. The idea that the executioner might have once been someone sworn to uphold the law struck a deep chord with those who believed the city's system was broken, corrupt, failing to punish the guilty. Others speculated that the executioner was a former prisoner, someone who had been wronged by the system in the past, someone whose life had been shattered by the very forces that were supposed to protect him. Some of the more paranoid rumors suggested that he had once been imprisoned unjustly, his life ruined by false accusations, and now he was out for vengeance. The idea that the executioner had a personal vendetta against the system only deepened the fear that gripped the city. If this was the work of someone with a long-standing grudge, then no one was safe, not even the most upstanding citizens. The theories and rumors, though, did little to solve the mystery. They only served to increase the paranoia that already gripped the streets. It didn't matter whether the executioner had once been a cop or a criminal. What mattered now was that he was out there, a force of vengeance, hunting those who had wronged him or others, and no one knew when or where he would strike next. His identity was irrelevant. It was his methods, his brutal execution, that were what people feared. The idea that no one knew where he would appear next, or who he would target, made everyone feel vulnerable. San Francisco, once a city of culture and life, had now become a city held hostage by fear. People began to change their routines. The streets that were once full of life and energy were now ghostly quiet after dark, with only the occasional figure darting down a street, hurried and nervous. Even the bravest residents began to take precautions, locking their doors tightly at night, double-checking their windows, and avoiding the dark corners of the city that had once felt so familiar. Everyone knew someone who had been affected by the deaths, and as the body count rose, the collective fear began to grow. It wasn't just that people were dying. It was the way they were dying. The brutality of the murders. The mark left behind. The sheer senselessness of it all. It made everyone feel like they were living in a nightmare that they couldn't escape. As the weeks passed, the police grew more frustrated. The mayor held press conferences, assuring the public that everything was being done to catch the killer. But behind closed doors, the police were beginning to lose hope. They had no leads, no suspects, no connection between the victims. It seemed as if the executioner could slip through their fingers no matter how many officers they sent out, no matter how many resources they devoted to the case. The more they searched, the more they realized just how powerless they were to stop him. The executioner wasn't just a man, he was a force, an idea that haunted the very fabric of the city. And this realization sent the police spiraling deeper into uncertainty. They could set up roadblocks, conduct raids, interrogate suspects, but as long as the executioner remained in the shadows, they would never catch him. He was a ghost, an unstoppable force, a killer who had no pattern and no discernible motive beyond his thirst for revenge. The police could do nothing to stop him. No matter how much they tried, he always seemed to be one step ahead, slipping through the cracks and disappearing into the fog. And that's exactly how it stayed for weeks. The police had no answers. The city lived in fear. People whispered, speculated, and hoped for a resolution. But deep down, they all knew it was a long shot. How could anyone hope to stop the executioner when they didn't even know who he was, when he could strike anywhere, at any time, without warning? The search for the executioner became less about finding the killer and more about surviving the terror that gripped San Francisco. People learned to avoid the dark streets, to stay in the well-lit areas, to lock their doors early. The fear of the unknown became as powerful as the fear of the executioner himself. People stopped trusting their neighbors, their friends, even their own instincts. No one knew who the killer was, and that uncertainty was far more terrifying than the murders themselves. And then, just when it seemed that the city might break under the weight of its own fear, a new victim was found. Another mark, another death, another piece in the growing puzzle. The executioner's hunt was far from over, and the city was still reeling, still afraid of what was to come. The legend had returned, and with it, a wave of terror that no one could stop, no matter how hard they tried. The executioner wasn't just a myth, he was real, and no one knew when or where his next strike would come. The air was thick with fog as Detective Mark Bennett made his way through the winding streets of San Francisco. The city had long since been swallowed by fear, and every corner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. For months, Mark had been chasing shadows, piecing together fragments of evidence that always seemed to lead nowhere. The executioner had been a ghost, a force of nature, slipping through their fingers time and again. But Mark, stubborn and determined, had not given up. He couldn't. The city was on the brink of collapse, and it was up to him to stop it. The search had taken him to places most people never ventured. Old, abandoned buildings, crumbling alleys, and decaying parts of the city where the fog hung low and thick like a blanket. He had tracked the executioner's movements, following the trail of bodies and the chilling mark he left behind. The more Mark investigated, the more he understood. This was no ordinary killer. The executioner wasn't just a man. He was something more, something darker. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was closing in on the end of this twisted story. Tonight, it all came to a head. The executioner had been cornered, and Mark knew where he had to go. The old cemetery on the edge of town was the executioner's final hiding place, a place where history had long since turned to dust, and the past seemed to haunt every broken tombstone and overgrown patch of land. The cemetery was abandoned, the gates rusted shut, and the grounds were forgotten by time. But not tonight. Tonight, it was the stage for the final confrontation. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way toward the decaying building near the cemetery, the place he had traced the executioner to. He knew it was a risk, but it was the only choice he had left. With nothing but a flashlight and his resolve, Mark stepped into the building. The air inside was damp, cold, and thick with the smell of old blood and dust. The walls, once white, were now stained with years of neglect, and the floor creaked under his weight as he moved forward. His footsteps echoed through the empty space, a constant reminder that he was alone. The sound of his breath was loud in the silence, but it was drowned out by the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every instinct told him to be cautious, to move slowly and carefully. But Mark didn't have the luxury of time. The executioner was here. He could feel it. As he ventured deeper in, and then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. Cloaked in shadow, the executioner stood motionless, his body just a silhouette against the dim light. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, and Mark could hear the sound of his own breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if time itself had stopped. Mark's hand instinctively reached for his gun, but then he remembered. He wasn't here to shoot. He was here to stop this. To end it. Come on, Bennett. The executioner's voice came, cold and menacing. You've been chasing me for months. You really think you can stop me? Mark's grip tightened on the flashlight as he took a step forward. I don't have a choice. This ends tonight. The executioner's figure shifted, and before Mark could react, he was moving, faster than Mark had expected. The fight that ensued was a blur of shadow and steel. Mark's flashlight flickered, casting erratic light across the room, illuminating the grotesque face of the man who had terrorized the city. The executioner swung a blade, a long, cruel weapon, aiming for Mark's throat. Mark barely managed to dodge, his heart hammering in his chest as he tried to regain his footing. The room seemed to close in around them. The executioner's laugh echoed through the room as Mark struggled to catch his breath. "You think you're the hero here, Bennett? You think you can save them? They all deserved it. Every single one of them." Mark gritted his teeth. "You're not a hero. You're a coward hiding behind a mask. This ends now." With a surge of energy, Mark lunged at the executioner, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled, rolling across the floor in a tangle of limbs. Mark's flashlight was knocked from his hand, but the cold steel of the executioner's blade glinted in the darkness. Mark's mind raced as he fought for control, each movement a battle for his life. He couldn't let the executioner win. Then, in one swift motion, Mark grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the floor and drove it into the executioner's side. The figure let out a strangled scream, the blade slipping from his hand as he collapsed to the floor. Mark stood over him, breathing heavily, his hands trembling with adrenaline and fear. The executioner's blood stained the floor, and for a moment, Mark felt nothing but the weight of his own exhaustion. The fight was over. The terror that had haunted San Francisco for so long had finally come to an end. But as Mark stood there, looking down at the body of the man who had caused so much pain, something was wrong. The executioner's eyes were open, staring up at him, unblinking. Mark's heart skipped a beat as the figure's lips curled into a grotesque smile. He was still alive. Before Mark could react, the body shifted, the shadow of the executioner rising up from the floor like a specter. The room seemed to close in around Mark, the walls growing tighter, suffocating him with an unseen pressure. The executioner wasn't done. He wasn't dead. It was as if he had never been alive at all. The police arrived soon after, but when they searched the building, the executioner's body was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving only the bloodstains and the empty shell of what was once a man. Mark stood in the center of the room, his breathing heavy, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. The nightmare was over, but in some deep, unsettling part of his mind, he knew it wasn't. The executioner had disappeared, but was he truly gone? Or had he merely retreated into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return? As the police secured the building, Mark stepped outside into the cool night air, his heart still racing. The fog rolled in once again, thick and suffocating, and the whispers began. The legend had ended, or so they thought. But Mark knew the truth. The executioner wasn't a man. He was a force, something more terrifying than anyone could truly comprehend. And as long as the fog clung to the streets of San Francisco, the city would never be free from its grip. The end. Or is it?